Welcome back to Limitless Detroit, episode number 3. I'm very excited to talk to Noah Francis here. Noah, I'm going to introduce you real quick, okay? And
sure.
if I screw it up, then you can let me know. Even though we already went through a comprehensive list of your titles here.
All good.
Noah does about everything in this area. No. So Noah Francis is Director of Sports Psychology at Oakland University. He is a medically retired U.S. Army, from the U.S. Army, bodybuilder.
Once upon a time.
Tag in there. Yeah.
Once upon a time.
And you can always tell a bodybuilder when they wear loose-fitting clothes and they still look huge. So congrats to you, man.
That was the dream one day.
That's
so
right.
We accomplished it.
That was the dream one day?
That was the dream.
All right, fair. Noah is also the co-founder and director of performance at Paradise Barbell in Rochester Hills. So Noah, thank you for coming on. I am psyched to talk to you, man.
Yeah, I'm humbled you asked me to be on this, so thank you for having me.
Humbled.
Yeah, humbled.
You know, I think the point of the podcast is to bring on experts in the field of like health, wellness, fitness, and you cover a pretty vast array of those topics, and we haven't really had a great chance, even just personally, to sit down and talk through some of the sports psych stuff. Though I send clients your way, and I really trust you a lot with that stuff, I'm looking forward to learning a little bit about what you had to say. None of this is rehearsed too, so I'm hoping you don't I don't know.
We always just go off the whim.
You go off the whim?
never prepare. Just always just show up, just go.
Yeah, I don't ever prepare either. This is just, no notes here. All right, man. Well, I want to talk about a couple of different things. We want to talk directly to youth athletes and parents of youth athletes. We also want to talk to the aging athlete who might be struggling. But before we get into any of that, I think it's pretty important just to kind of discuss like psychology and sports performance and how all this stuff fits together. So I guess let me just guide you here first. Like what is it that you do?
I know that's honestly sounds like an oversimplified question, but it's one I get every day. When people hear what I do and I say I'm a sports psychology clinician, they're like, "That's so sick." Yeah. Then like, what is that actually though?
Yeah. That's right.
So like you kind of said, it kind of is embedded within a lot of different things that come with performance and functionality, and that's mind and body at the end of the day connected. A lot of my research and a lot of what I practice within in philosophy as a practitioner comes down to this kind of big word. You don't need to remember it, but psychoneuroimmunology, and that's the connection and the inner flowing states between the psyche, the neurology, and the immunology of the human body, right, in a holistic level. So I get to tap into all three of those pillars and kind of figure out personalized, individual, customized ways where we can implement, usually more than not, mental drills to establish mental skills to then be able to establish resilience and mental toughness. We hear those words all the time in the media, and especially with athletes and athletes who succeed in sport, but even just in generality in life. We always use those things, but what do they really mean? And what I get to do is actually establish the realities, the practices, and the tangibility and action points within each of those more tagline words and give a lot of practicality to it.
I love that, man. And I mean, locally in Detroit, the word floating around all over the place is grit too, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if I've told you this. I'm coaching my oldest son's flag football team.
I didn't know that.
And we have something called the Grit Award every week, just to motivate these kids to kind of push it a little bit harder.
Anybody
kind of
bite kneecaps yet?
No kneecap biting yet.
Oh,
but I will say this though, they get a little badge of honor. It's like a neon colored headband or wristbands or something if they go a little bit above and beyond. But grit is a key word as well. Like Angela Duckworth, is that the author that wrote the book Grit?
It sounds familiar,
I know my wife and I talk about that concept all the time, but you're literally, your practice is focused around developing resilience, and you said skills and drills, right?
Just
to basically get more grit.
Just like we do, and whether it's in the gym or whether it's what you do every day as a physical therapist, like you're incorporating small, tangible things to incorporate that actually establish outcomes, right? So the outcome of grit, right? There's tangible, actionable, and perception-based orientation that actually, that's how you have the reality of it.
Love that.
And so this is kind of the groundwork of kind of paving the ways of making it accessible to people.
That's cool. I think that makes a lot of sense to people that are listening and watching. I think you outlined that super well, actually, so they'll have a good idea.
I get asked every day, so I'm glad I can.
You get asked every day.
Finally, years later, have a good elevator pitch.
My oldest brother he's in like the B2B world, business to business, and I remember for the longest time, I never understood what he did, and he never, like, what do you do, Justin? And he was a consultant back in the day. I'm like, I don't know what that means. I was a teenager, maybe, but still. I feel like you outlined it.
I'm an adult and I don't even know what that means.
That's fair. That's fair. All right, well, hey, let's move into kind of the performance for competitive athletes that are younger. Okay. Obviously, at Limitless, we work with a ton of injured athletes. We see them sometimes post-surgically, sometimes in the middle of, a situation where they have game day 2 days from now and they're struggling with something. We work with more the physical side of that. But we certainly see the psychological fallout as well. And though we're not equipped to deal with that as much, we end up spending a lot of time with these people. So I feel like all of us end up having to, I don't know, to some degree, just deal with some of those things with people. So I'm curious, when you look at mental challenges for young athletes specifically, what are the most common things that you see in competitive athletes?
Yeah, I'm going to say, not to screw up your notes or anything, but age honestly doesn't have the biggest role within major themes that we see. I would say the modalities that we start incorporating is probably when you differentiate when it comes to age. How deep can someone go, right? How much experience do they have kind of dictate the skills and drills that I incorporate and help lead people through.
Sure.
So when you say younger age athletes, I'm going to kind of take that as anywhere from kind of majority high school athlete, right? And probably more so the high school athlete that actually has aspirations to do something with it. Usually is when we see more of the sports psych have more, I would say, weight, right? Because it means something to them.
Yeah.
And I think across all ages, especially when it comes to injury, right? Or a failure or pressure, stress, nerves, performance anxiety, all those things, I think the largest theme would be identity, right? And identity being approached upon, whether their outlet, which would be their sport, is being infringed upon not having the physical ability due to injury, right? Or they have a terrible performance, right? And so then their identity is infringed upon because their performance now represents like how they see themselves when they look in the mirror, right? Or how they're assuming other people are looking at them, right? And that puts more pressure than really the reality is calling for. And so I usually start kind of with any age group, but especially high school, college age athletes, in differentiating value and representation of identity through outlet like sport and the actual identity of that person, because those are different.
So that, look, when I hear you say that, I think of the person, like the individual versus the player, almost as two different sections of the person, right? That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So when we look at this separation of person player, what type of tools are you often then helping young athletes work through those things?
Yeah, so the tool honestly completely depicts of what that person, that individual needs. So a lot of times I work with teams, right, and we're giving more of that surface level generality. Here's a skill that you can use and utilize when see fit. When it comes to an individual basis, this is when we get a lot more practicality and actually get to see, I would say, more refined and productive results at a quicker time period. I always like to think about it, whether you call it a tool belt, right? Or I kind of think of it as like a golf bag, right? Every golfer has 14 golf clubs in their bag, or should, right?
I carried like 17, 18 sometimes. No one knows.
And if I was to strip 13 of the 14 away and I would say, hey, you're a good golfer, go hit your best round ever, it's quite literally impossible. Could you get through a round with just a 7-iron? Sure. Will it be your best round? I'd argue definitely not. Will it be your worst round? It's probably set up to be one of the worst ones. Even if you're amazing with your 7-iron, there's a usability and functionality that thing has, right? So when it comes to mental skills and tools that we implement, I first look at, like, one, what are the strengths? So what are the tools that you already have that maybe even you haven't identified? What are the clubs or the tools that you're missing? And then how can we use a combination of tapping into the strengths while introducing the weakness and bring them together at a slow, controlled, manageable rate where over, say, a month, 2 months, 3 months, you now have 14 clubs in your bag, rather than throwing them a bag of clubs that they've never seen before, all 14 at once, and then being like, what do I do with this? And they show up at a Frisbee golf range rather than a golf club.
Like, hey, try this mental exercise and do this breathing thing and do all these things. Like, just 19 things to remember every time that you need to cope with something.
It's funny too, because a lot of times people get out there to sport, and my whole goal for most athletes is to get them to be functioning and performing without thought, or with well-controlled processed thought. And usually when you add more thought, a lot of people, when it's not directed, they get in almost like paralysis through overanalysis, right? And they're out there thinking too much. And so there's a period of time where it takes, like, hey, this is the room, this is the space for us to process, explore, and implement new skills. And you have to drill it. That's why earlier I called it drills to incorporate skills, is you have to drill it. Just like if you bring up golf again, if you're trying to make a mechanical change of a golf swing, you got to do it hundreds and thousands of times in order to actually be able to utilize it in a round without the added thought, right?
Yeah.
So it's getting away from thought over time, but you have to put the work ethic and the incorporated intentional skill in an accessible realm way prior to them actually utilizing it within the performance theater.
That's so interesting, man. There are so many parallels between the physical and the psychological.
Yeah.
I hear you talk in some other podcasts that I listen to that are largely psychological based. I hear things and I'm thinking this is exactly how it is in the way that I work with people.
Yeah.
It's just a different realm of the being. For example, I mean, you're talking about the concept of neuroplasticity to some degree.
Yeah, so the word out of my mouth.
Yeah. And for those, I mean, that's a crazy word, but I mean, it's just essentially something being plastic means it's moldable. It has the ability and the capacity to change and to shift, right?
Yeah. Everyone has neural pathways already established, right? So they have a way that feels normal to them, whether it's right or wrong, right? And a lot of times there are things that are right or can be improved upon. A lot of times there are things that are quite simply just asinine and wrong, right? So we get to go in and look at those, and we get to incorporate these drills to retrain with intentionality, put focus on it now, and so that we retrain the neural pathways to actually incorporate neuroplasticity, which is a new trained skill, right? And then be able to incorporate it with intention within their function. So
I think that in the rehabilitation sciences and sports psychology, I see a huge potential for, especially the competitive athletes that have the world on their shoulders, for that to work in tandem during a rehab process, especially because you're developing neuroplasticity around the physical self of, take an ACL reconstruction, for example. It's not just physical. You're trying to gain muscle, you're trying to gain range of motion. But beyond that, and in between you and I, there's also developing confidence and reducing fear around certain movements, right? And that happens, like you just said, through repetition and exposure to those movements over and over and over again, with maybe some different cueing and other things. But if you can address also the stuff that we see in the back of young athletes' minds, which is, am I ever gonna get recruited?
yeah,
Am I going to let my parents down, right? My dad was a pro athlete. What if I don't make it that way? Like those are just a few of the things that we hear in and out every single week. And if you can address all of that, maybe that's too much too.
I'd even push back a little bit. I think addressing is a proper word, but trying to eliminate those thoughts is completely wrong. Trying to eliminate those emotions, trying to eliminate fear is not what I'm trying to do with athletes. It's actually trying to help better regulate emotions that we're supposed to have. That is life. It's not. When people talk about self-talk, and I'm like, all right, Seth, we're gonna sit down, we have a group, we're talking about self-talk. What do you think I'm gonna bring up? Do this, don't do that.
Yeah, sure.
Positive and negative. Have positive self-talk, not negative self-talk, right? That's what everyone kind of would assume. I would say you're missing the mark. It's misunderstood, where it's not about positive and negative, getting rid of one, having more of the other. There's so many unhealthy levels within that just initial framework and perspective. It is actually coming down to, how do we build up? How do we accept and have constructive self-talk rather than continuing to have deconstructive self-talk? There's positive and negative under both of those themes. It's just the intention and direction you take with it. And so it's the same thing we're talking about emotional regulation. If you're experiencing performance anxiety, you're saying, stop being anxious. There's no need to be anxious. I shouldn't be nervous. I shouldn't have fear. No, you should. But here's tools for you to help regulate that, to boost your autonomic nervous system to be a performance enhancer rather than it be a performance limiter.
I love that, man, and that resounds true with what we do too. I think we try to reduce fear about certain movements, but the perfect parallel to what you're talking about is the conversation that we have with the patients around pain. Pain is stigmatized equally with anxiety and intrusive thoughts and all the things that you're talking about there. And pain is not bad. Pain is similar to anxiety and similar to nervousness and feeling bad and all these things. Pain is an alarm system that you could just tune it out, but we see people really go down some dark holes that way as well. You could let it rule your life, right? And unfortunately, that breeds an adult down the road that is hypersensitive to every physical discomfort that happens to them. The middle ground is always curiosity and developing a better relationship with pain. Which is, like, to me, a perfect parallel to what you're talking about. Maybe.
You know, I love that you use the word curiosity, because you do this all the time, especially with elite level Division I athletes, right? I tell them, hey, stay curious, right? Stay curious, because that curiosity is going to actually start asking questions. So whether you are currently having poor emotional regulation, right, and you're repressing that fear or saying I shouldn't have these emotions or what have you, right? If you remain curious, you're going to start asking why. You're going to start asking, well, in this moment I'm anxious, I don't think I can do this. But if you remain curious, whether it's in that moment or after, the next time you're in that moment, hopefully you get to that conclusion of like, wait a second, I'm telling myself I am not capable, but in reality, in practice, I very much am.
Yeah.
So then you start talking back. And that's the number one thing you asked a little bit earlier, kind of circling back to younger athletes. The very first, and one of the first things I bring up to people is, if someone in your life, say a sibling, comes and says some off-the-wall stuff, not true thing, crazy, puts you in a bad light in front of people you care about, and they say that, they declare it to everybody, usually you don't sit there and just take it and accept it, right? Usually you're like, whoa, what? And you talk back. But when you take the people out of it and you insert self-talk, your own individual conversations in your head,
really
you declare statements to yourself, off the wall, not true, I can't do this. And then in reality, you can't. So you don't talk back like you would otherwise. So I tell people, hey, here's a mental skill. Remind yourself, talk back, whether it's something you saying I can do this or can't do this, talk back to it and give it reasoning and give it direction. Because when you start talking back, remaining curious, you're going to get a fuller answer rather than simply just a declared statement that might be true, might be untrue, but who's to know?
Dude, that is a profoundly helpful tip, I feel like, for young people. Maybe a bit hard for like a real young person to understand, but for parents out there to hear that and teach their kids to talk back to themselves, I love that, dude.
Whenever I introduce this to kids and teams, I always say, do not go home and tell your parents I told you to start talking back.
Yeah, that's right.
But I do tell them, I do want you to talk back to yourself.
Yeah, I love that. I was going to ask you, like, what's one essential mental skill that every young athlete should have? And that's it right there,
Yeah,
I think, right?
I think that answered that question.
That's perfect, man. Well, so let's move on to more of the middle-aged former athlete.
Yeah.
No, not really. I wasn't much. My wife, I always tell people, my wife was a far better athlete than I ever was or probably ever will be.
Yeah,
so.
I believe it.
But seriously. All right, so I do want to move into that age bracket, though, because not only do we see a lot of those people, and our audience is full of a lot of middle-aged people getting back into fitness maybe for the first time, or trying Orange Theory. And there's a lot of complexity that happens, obviously, as you become an adult, right? A lot of different challenges. But I guess what type of differences do you see? I know you mentioned earlier that there's really not, you don't really treat it a lot differently. It's just the ability for depth, right?
Yeah.
Like how deep can that person go?
Mm-hmm.
But what, like in your clinical practice to some degree, what differences have you observed?
Well, there's differences in how I approach it. Whether the theme in itself, I think, does come back in the most part identity, and then devaluation and misrepresenting that outlet as identity. So I think the same comes for a former athlete, or maybe even you weren't ever an athlete, or you might be middle-aged and you're trying a lot of these new things.
Yeah.
Different outlets, right?
Yeah.
It could be your job, it could be your relationships. When those outlets are stripped away from you, you have to have the ability to reframe and understand that you are still the same person. Yeah. And simply the outlet was the action of you being able to live that through. And so whenever I work with more middle-aged or even college-age athletes a lot, I do a session that honestly takes 1 to 3 sessions long of this one single skill and tool, and it's us identifying who you are. A lot of times I ask people the question, it's so simple, but it is so complex. Who are you? And they're dumbfounded. They sit there, and then a lot of times I get descriptors like their height, their age, right, what they do, their title, things like that. But we dig a little deeper, because how many millions of people would fit that same description? But how many versions of people are there of you? There's a single one, right? So let's identify what that is. And so we get into principles and values, and you talk about purpose and reason and what resonates with you, you look up to somebody in your life. Why? What about them do you want to be more like, right? Yeah, and that incites principles and values. And then from there, we give it direction with essentially establishing a mission. And this is different than a corporate mission statement. It's them identifying essentially an anchor that they can connect with. The biggest word there is connect with every single day, of what actionable steps can they live that mission through that day. Right. No matter if you can or cannot play that sport anymore, you can still live that out in a different way. This changed my life and my story in a huge way, where, a lot of things had happened in my life that stripped away a lot of my functionality and my purpose and where I was destined to go. Right. And then I wouldn't be here doing this job without me attaching weight. My identity is in my mission, not in my outlet. And the outlet is simply, this is how I get to do it today.
Yeah.
But forever and always, whether you're an athlete, that competitive athletic season is going to end. That journey is going to end. We're going to change roles within your career, right? Relationships grow and they change and they develop. You have to have the adaptability to connect every day with what that mission is. And then your outlets, those change. And you're in more control of them. And when they're stripped away, you're now empowered. Okay, how do I live this out? You're challenged to go refine it rather than sit there and just be like, this is happening to me. Because that's a dark, depressing road that can turn your life around really quick in a bad way or in a really empowering way.
Let's, if you don't mind, let's take that a little bit deeper.
Okay.
I want to, because I think this is going to represent a lot of different people that are listening in. How do we take that person that you're kind of painting a picture of there, and what are some strategies, I guess, maybe that you can give us? I'm going to throw myself into that to avoid what I would perceive as a really unhealthy comparison to our former self, which again, not having your expertise at all, I've had conversations with people where I often will tell them, that you are a different person now. That's probably not very good advice to give them, but what you get to choose what happens next in your life. And when you compare yourself to this former version of you, who is not the same person with the same experiences, with the same hardening and the same injury history and all of that, it's not even fair. It's not on the same level even. So what strategies would you give that person?
Yeah, I think you're honestly sitting on a gold mine. So you're not far off at all. I think you're actually just hitting it right on the head, and it's just we're missing the tools. And that's where sports psychology and me being what I get to do every day is, it's honestly a little bit more simple and close to us than people think. Because we use these words all the time of standards and expectations. All the time, right? A lot of times people use those words like synonymously. They are very, very different, okay? So usually with an athlete, especially an injured athlete, no matter the age, right? I insert that MVP process I just talked about, right? Establishing principles, mission, and then vision.
Sure.
And from there we have perception and awareness, right? Now we're incorporating skills. Okay, how do we incorporate this in our life? So exactly what you're talking about. And usually what is super tough for someone who's injured is they have experience, in real life experience of what they once were, and now they have this desperate need, this vision to get back there. They have to change, one, their expectation and standard of today, and their expectation and standard of what that future looks like. If you're still an athlete and you're getting back to play, the getting back to probably is consistent.
Yeah.
If it takes you out of that sport forever, that's vastly different, and you need to change the expectation. Because if you're living with an expectation of a certain level of performance, just physically, and you can't obtain that day, that week, that month, of course you're going to be just beaten down and reminded of I suck. You do suck at performing because you can't. Quite honestly. So you're not far off with that conclusion, but it's just so misdirected because you're putting yourself to an expectation that quite honestly you physically cannot accomplish. So I go with athletes. I literally sit down, put a whiteboard in between us, and I write up expectations and standards, and we start with the standards of what's a non-negotiable this week.
Yeah.
Right? What can you do this week, in the next 2 weeks, non-negotiables? What are your daily practices of functionality and performance? And a lot of times that is PT, right? That is rehab. Things like that, right? That is them controlling and getting to what we do, our wellness pillars. So that's sleep and sleep routines. That's light and sunlight exposure. That's movement, nutrition, social connection, and stress control.
Love it. Yeah.
Right? So those are the pillars we work off of. And it's essentially, what are the standards, your non-negotiables you will do, and then within that parameter of your reality, what are your expectations? So these are more so a better synonym for expectation would be goal. If you're taking care of your standards, what can you achieve on your good days? And then we look back after the week or 2 weeks. Okay, let's look at, do you meet your standards, meet your expectations? If your expectations were met 90% of the time, that expectation becomes a standard. And we then replace that expectation with that next goal, right? This is the literal staircase of progression, development, and growth. You can see this in physical injuries and recovery, right? With degrees of motion and things like that, strength, functionality. But also in the mental space, it's like either you can set yourself up to dive in and attack that and optimize that, or you could be fighting that whole time. Right. Psychoneuroimmunology, they don't just work together, they also very much can work against each other.
Certainly, yeah. I love that.
So standards and expectations would be, honestly,
I like that.
It's a skill and a tool that you have to sit down and represent. Commit yourself to writing it out, and then commit yourself to looking back, using that feedback.
With
Success,
honesty as well. Right? You have to
success
be real
or
honest with it.
failure, that's feedback. You got to, what you're talking about earlier, you got to use feedback as essentially this thing that
Right.
you can use for information to improve upon, or you can ignore it and continue to hit a wall with your head.
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense. I love that. Thank you for that insight, man. It's
Yeah.
good. There's a lot of buzzwords out there in the mental health field. Mindfulness being a huge one. My oldest son, again, second time I've talked about him, but he just started going to a martial arts center, Rochester School of Martial Arts downtown Rochester, and a really incredible environment there. And he is just psyched to do jiu-jitsu and like all the amazing things that they work on. But they, at one of his first sessions, the owner of the dojo there sat down with a bunch of kids and discussed mindfulness, about describing it as the ability to be aware that your mind or that your focus is wandering, the ability to be aware and to pull it back, almost like a puppy. He talked about how you can train a puppy to some degree, and when you're paying attention to that puppy, the puppy might be very attentive, and as soon as you look away, it's chewing on a shoe somewhere and ripping out like your sofa stuffing there. But and how, what's that?
R.I.P.
R.I.P. That's right. But in that situation with mindfulness and with such young kids there, it just had me thinking about what your thoughts, I guess, are on that word, and maybe more usefully for everyone, like what are some first steps that people can take to develop better mindfulness?
Yeah, mindfulness is a tough one because it is a buzzword, but also it's one of those words just like in your field, health.
Yeah.
Right?
Health.
What does that mean?
That's funny. Yeah,
One, it's individualized.
you're right.
It truly is,
Yeah.
based off of that person's goals. Some person might be, I'm healthy, like I can do all my daily functions.
Right.
But for someone else who like their goal and functionality is based around performing in like a CrossFit setting,
Right.
they're not going to deem themselves as healthy.
That's
so
fair.
mindfulness is similar to that, where it's individualized for one. And for two, I think much like self-talk, it's a little bit misguided because people, when I hear this word all the time, like control what you can control.
Yeah.
Again, you're not wrong, but I do think you're not necessarily hitting the button head on, right? I like to use the word influence a lot better because we cannot control thought. We cannot control thought. One of the first things I do with athletes and anybody in generality is talk about the mind-body connection. And there's 4 foundational components and variables I can look at where whether it's on or off, doesn't matter, this is connected. Is active thought with unconscious emotion, has influence on physical state, hormones, things like that, and that influences execution. And that execution feeds feedback, result, which leads to that next active thought. And so within that cycle, if I try to control, all I'm going to do is get frustrated and hit my head against that wall again. Here's an example for you and your listeners, right?
Yes.
I want you guys to do not think of a pink elephant. What is the thing that comes to the forefront of your mind?
I don't want to say it, but
A pink
obviously
elephant. Quite honestly,
yeah.
it will be a pink elephant.
Yeah.
Now stop thinking of that pink elephant. Don't think of it. It's a tough task. Some people are like, this is impossible.
Yeah.
Other people are like, that's really hard, but then they accomplish it. My job is we go in and we influence thought by first accepting that I cannot control someone else telling me do not do something, right? So if you're saying don't think of a pink elephant, that's all I'm thinking about. But we do have the ability to redirect, and influence that next thought. Elephants aren't pink, right?
That's right.
I first experienced that when I watched Dumbo when I was 2 years old, right? It was not pink, right?
Yeah.
And then I had a real world experience, I had the opportunity to go to Africa in my young 20s and saw elephants out in the wild, right? They were beautiful, they were massive, they were awesome. I can remember the experiences, the smells, and the peoples I was with, right? Those elephants were very much gray.
Oh yeah.
Right? And now, as I'm directing that thought, influencing it back and redirecting it back to reality, guess what I'm thinking about? The people I was with.
Yeah.
The reality of like the beauty and the power of that moment, right? And no longer stuck on this action that was prompted of not doing. So
I thought you were going to say you were thinking about the Toto song.
we do.
That's
love
where I
that
thought you were
song.
going with that, but no.
Africa. Theme song of the trip for sure. But to get back to mindfulness, right? If we try to control, not just be aware, but then control where that thought goes, we're gonna be not having a lot of mindfulness. We're gonna have a lot of frustration. So I always go back to within mindfulness. Yes, we need awareness. yes, we need to instill proactive measures of how we can enhance our emotional regulation, how we can enhance what we do when things don't go the way we want them to, redirection, reframing, things like that. And so that we can best influence, no matter what the result or prompt is, we can get back to task.
Love it.
So it's influence, and it's influence embedded, and it's never control embedded, because no matter what, we'll never be able to control thought, but we always can control essentially our response by how we redirect, if we redirect.
I love that, man.
Thanks.
That's very, very insightful, I would say.
I can't steal it. That just comes from literature and studies and being in the field. But I'm glad I could
being amazing.
Outline it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just amazing. I don't know what to tell you. No, hey, I really appreciate it. I guess moving into more about you, if you don't mind. You're the director of sports psychology at OU. Mm-hmm. You work with teams. You work with individual athletes there. You're the director of performance, co-founder of Paradise Barbell, like we mentioned earlier. You have a role over there where you're working one-on-one with people as well. Mm-hmm. So what, if people do want to get in touch with you, because athletes all over the place are looking for help on how to sort their way through these things. How can they get in touch with you? What's the best way?
Yeah, I would honestly go to our website, paradisebarbell.com, and on there there's contact forms. So I always have a list of our services. There's a sports psychology dedicated page on there. We can get more information, pricing, things like that. And we have a contact form. That's probably the best way. If you manage to have my phone number, you can also, I think that's on our website as well, you can reach out to me that way. If you call, I don't answer. Probably because I'm in session all the time. So leave a voicemail, text me on that number, even if you just want to start with that, that works too. You can find us on our Instagram, Paradise Barbell. Mm-hmm. And from there, you can always just reach out, and then we can set up a free consultation meeting, right? Usually done over the phone or Zoom or something like that. And then we can talk about what and how we, or myself, can be a service to you and your goals. And I think at the end of the day, I'm not a salesman, but I think our mission that me and my co-founder Ben established in Paradise Barbell is bringing the mind and body under one roof. Now, we don't have everything under there, but what we do have is we have very highly skilled and trained personal trainers, as well as online programs and access to nutritional professionals, but we also have the access to a sports psychology clinician outside of the professional sports world, outside of Division I sports, and that's not very common. Sure. And I think very, very unique that you can find under our roof. So if you go to our website, paradisebarbell.com, it's probably the best way to reach us at our contact form right there.
Love that. Cool. Thank you. Well, I learned a ton today, and it's really fun just to have that conversation with you. At the very least, it was a blast just to be talking through this stuff, and I think there's a lot of shared interests, a lot of shared experiences even that you and I have working with the same people. Yeah. So I look forward to talking with you more.
Yeah, it's been a blessing to be around you guys for the last 3 years, get to know you very well, and have interacting through clients, but also personal life. Sure. So I look forward to the future, and anybody who has questions, reach out. I know in podcasts, especially when it comes to sports psych, you talk a lot of generality. I have a mission of being able to provide actual information and tangibility to just these loose concepts like mindfulness, right? Yeah. So if you have questions about that, you can reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to get you set up with someone who might be more accessible to you, or stepping into something with myself. At the end of the day, just trying to root for people and help people accomplish their goals.
Love it. Cool. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.